Hi everyone. Okay, it's time for us to dive into Lecture 15. I am still grading your exams. Your GSIs are grading their sections as well, and they're doing a fabulous job. They're way ahead of me. I will do my best to get them to you as soon as possible. So from what I can tell, you guys are doing well, and we're really happy. So what we're going to focus on today is community ecology and species interactions through things like herbivory and predation and parasitism, and all sorts of other good stuff. So now we get to apply those things that we talked about before. Okay, so what I want to go ahead and do first is have us work through a problem, multiple choice, okay? So I want you to read through this. The first thing you do when you see graphs, of course, you read the axes and then read the question, the information it's telling you, and then go ahead and address the question and choose. Go ahead and pause lecture now, and then once you're ready, go ahead and start things up again, all right? Give it a shot and see what happens. So hopefully you chose C. I'm sorry, E. All the treatments. I think that's the second time I've said that today. All right, so now the reason is because they're all per capita death rate, as you can see, okay? And the question is saying that, we know that the x-axis is population density, and it wants to know which treatment has a density-dependent effect on the per capita death rate. So in other words, which one has values that change as density increases, and all of them do. Okay, which is why all of the treatments, E is the correct answer. And if that doesn't make sense, let me know. So when it comes to levels of biological organization, okay, so ecology, and we talked about this before, is the study how organisms interact with each other in their environment. But then a community is a group of species that live and interact within a given geographic area, okay? So the key with community is that you have multiple different types of species there, and that's how they interact with one another that you're focusing on. Okay, so species interactions have two main outcomes, and I want you guys to write these down. So on your slide, write a short term and a long term. Now, in the short term, species can affect distribution and abundance of other species. So species can affect distribution and abundance of other species on ecological timescales like the growing season or a few years. Okay, now that's the short term. Ultimately, what can happen though is in the long term, they can influence the evolution of other species they interact with. Okay, so, but this is on evolutionary timescales like generations. All right, so in the short term, they can affect, some species can affect the distribution and abundance of other species. Timescales like growing season or a few years. In the long term, they can influence the evolution of interacting species, so on evolutionary timescales like generations. Now, here we have a predator, which is a stink bug, and it's feeding on a monarch caterpillar, while the milkweed plant, they're both on a milkweed plant. So the plants face an endless onslaught of attack by herbivores. We know this. By feeding on herbivores, though, predatory insects also protect the plants. It's like an indirect effect. Okay, and scientists study these organisms to understand the community and evolutionary ecology of interactions between the milkweed plant and then the insect herbivores that prey upon it. So there are, if those of you, if you've read your extra credit potential possibilities for this term, and if you guys choose what a plant knows, there's a section in there that actually suggests that plants will give off chemicals to try and bring insects in that are predators to eat whoever happens to be eating the plant. How cool is that? Okay, so plants actually communicate with one another. We don't give our plant brethren enough credit, and they do all sorts of really cool things that scientists are only now beginning to understand. Now, other interactions that critters can have with one another include enemy-victim interactions, okay? And so clockwise from the top, you've got predation, where an eagle is eating a canvasback duck. You have herbivory down below, where the monarch caterpillar is eating a leaf. And then you have parasitism, like the cordyceps fungus, which is parasitizing an ant. So the whole idea in this situation is there's a consumer, which is known as the enemy, okay? And something that is being consumed, and that's the victim. Write all this down. There's a consumer, the enemy, and something that's being consumed, that's the victim. This will include predator-prey, and this is otherwise known as predation. This also, have I mentioned, write all this down? This is also things like host parasite, otherwise known as parasitism. I might have mentioned before that my husband and I lovingly call our daughter our little parasite. And she takes every last resource she can get her hands on. We also have the herbivore-plant interaction where it's herbivory. Okay, and at the end of lecture, we're going to show a really cool video on cordyceps, by the way. We don't always appreciate how amazing fungi can really be. They can have a really profound impact on humans other critters, including humans, and we'll talk about that later too. That's pretty interesting. So when it comes to herbivory, okay, this of course is going to influence the plants. And the way herbivory can influence plants is to impact the population size by removing individuals. They can also potentially alter the growth rate by damaging the plant. And if a plant gets damaged, the damage has to be repaired, so then it can't put as many resources towards new growth. Okay, and so this also can influence the plant on the evolutionary perspective. So this will favor predation. If there's defensive compounds, it can favor that, as well as community structure. So community structure will favor plant species that have the ability to defend themselves, and those, of course, will increase in abundance. Now, the pictures we have here, the aspen is on the left, an aspen leaf, and there is a leaf miner insect. Okay, and so I will admit, I never would have thought some little larva could have such a huge impact, which, by the way, is on the bottom left of the picture, of a plant, but the reality is I've actually, long ago when I was in grad school, long ago in a very different time, so 20 years ago, goodness, time flies. Anyway, so about 20 years ago when I was drove to Alaska and back with a friend of mine to collect samples, I will never forget, we would pass through just these huge forests of aspen, quaking aspen, which were incredibly cool, but so many of their leaves had been damaged by these leaf miner insects, and it's something I never would have anticipated. And so when that happens, of course, the plants don't photosynthesize as well, and then they have to go back to repairing tissue, and it's a big issue. So I've not been back to the same forests, in so long to see what's going on now, but even little guys can have a huge impact on forests, I'm afraid. And so then, of course, you've got a giraffe munching on a tree very happily. The tree, by the way, is not so happy. Just to give you an idea of how much herbivores can really impact plants, here you can see a deer exclosure experiment where there's been fencing that have not allowed deer to come in. And so you're looking at the same part of forest where deer have been blocked off, as well as an area where deer are allowed to go. And you can see there's a huge difference in the number of plants that are available. And basically the deer can just mow things down. It's something that you don't necessarily think of. But if you'll recall, I had you watch that Wolves Change Rivers video. And so this is one of the pieces of data that they used when they put that together, because we know that deer really have a negative impact. They're cute, they're fuzzy, I get it. I like deer too. They're, gentle herbivores and so forth. But unfortunately, they can really alter the structure of a forest. Now, the insect group might be a group that you don't normally think about. So remember, these guys are eukarya, the kingdom animals, phylum arthropods. Write down what shared derived traits they have. You guys should know this, okay? And then what I want you to do is to then consider the subphylum, the hexapods. What are their shared derived traits? So if this is not in your book, by the way, you are more than welcome to use outside sources. So take a moment, write this down, and when you're ready, start up again. So in arthropods, the synapomorphies include an exoskeleton, jointed appendages, and the fact they molt as they grow. Did I mention you should write this down? Exoskeleton, jointed appendages, and they molt as they grow. Now the hexapods, which includes the insects, they have a body with 3 segments. Think of an ant. Okay, it's shown really nicely. They have a head and a thorax with 6 legs and an abdomen. Okay, other shared characteristics include metamorphosis. And by the way, insects are incredibly diverse, and they're the most diverse group of arthropods, and actually the most diverse of animals in general. Okay, so we don't give our insects enough credit. They really are, a huge part of nature. So just to orient you, so remember coinoflagellates, you guys know what those are, sponges, cnidarians, all sorts of other good stuff. Think back to the slides from lecture 2 ago. And then the arthropods fit within a group called the ecdysozoas, okay, and the insects are within the arthropods. And so, no, you don't have to, memorize this or anything. Just kind of know who's where and, from an evolutionary perspective, how this is oriented. So just to clarify, things that are not insects, okay? So worms, of course, are not insects. Spiders are not insects, okay? So pill bugs, the roly-polies, also not insects. All right, those fit in with wood lice. The centipedes and so forth, also not insects. So insects are actually pretty specific with regards to their taxonomic group. They've got those, those shared synapomorphies, and so that's what makes them an insect. So, but they're, a lot, some people, I don't know about all of you. I'm not going to lie, when I was younger, I was like, ew, a bug. Okay, sorry, I hate to admit it, but I was. Just the way I was. Then I became an ecologist, and I had a friend of mine that he and I went out to Arizona together so we could work together in the field. And he remembers scratching his head one time and looking at me, and he goes, he's like, you don't like your insects, but you're so into science. He's like, this makes no sense. Kind of true. So I appreciate insects very much so. They really do make up a good chunk of the biomass on Earth, and, they are pretty interesting little critters. However, I just like to keep them at a distance. What can I say? In fact, insects are the most species-rich group of animals. Through the processes of herbivory and pollination, they have interactions where they've co-evolved, okay? Insects and plants have co-evolved together. And so actually one of the groups with the most numbers of species are beetles. And in fact, Charles Darwin was asked one time if he thought there was a creator, and if so, what did he think of the creator? And Darwin's response was, well, that he had an inordinate fondness for beetles, because there were so many of those little guys. So probably what helped to make insects so successful is their relationship with plants, and particular angiosperms, because they pollinate and they do so well, and actually they've kind of co-evolved together. So that's why they have flowers. Plants have flowers because they're trying to lure insect pollinators in and to get them to pollinate. And if you guys look around now, when next time you go outside, hint, hint, go outside. And you see flowers, generally insects are attracted towards the lighter ones that have more of a smell or maybe a UV pattern that happens. And then the hummingbirds and animals and so forth tend to be attracted to brighter colors like reds and so forth. And that's not a hard and fast rule. There's all sorts of different variations on that, but it's still pretty interesting. So if you happen to take a look at this graph and you see the average number of species per fossil assemblage and then over millions of years, you can definitely figure out when the angiosperms kind of kicked in. And so the angiosperms are the most species-rich group of plants, and the insects, of course, are involved in herbivory and pollination, and so the angiosperms and the insects kind of co-evolve together. So here's a question. Are all insects herbivores or mutualists? Take a second and think about it. What's the key word that should instantly start making you, think of a red flag? That would be the all. Okay, so of course the answer is no. There are tons of predators that are insects. There are parasites like fleas. Dragonflies are pretty cool predators. There are a lot of, herbivores, but there's also, mutualists. But there's just so many insects that anytime you see the phrase all, okay, that should light up in your head that probably is not the case. So here we have a picture of a dung beetle, which is another kind of insect, and these guys feed on feces, usually produced by herbivores. So this guy is not an herbivore, nor is he a pollinator, and of course you might be thinking, ew, okay. However, they eke out a living, they do okay, all right, and believe it or not, apparently for insects, poop is a relatively good food source. So several different critters are adapted to using feces or dung as either a larval or adult food source, and yes, I know, gross. However, it works for them, so we just kind of, let them do their thing. So if you guys remember from the video that I had you watch last week, or lecture that we had last week, when it came to life early on, things were really happening in the ocean first, okay? So when eventually critters would start moving to land, animals actually couldn't go there because initially they didn't have anything to eat, okay? So our ancestors at the bottom left, we would be very fashionably late to land, okay? And the guys that would make it first, of course, were the plants. So plants would get to land first, then the insects, okay, of this group, and then the tetrapods, but we would take a while because, of course, we didn't, again, you know, not having anything to eat, they had to wait a while until there was a decent food source. Okay, so we've discussed the arthropod and insect diversity. Now it's time for us to go to constitutive and induced defenses, which of course happen in plants. So let's actually apply this, okay? And this is particularly pertinent to right now because I just pulled a poison ivy plant out of my garden that was impacting my husband greatly, and for about a week he was having a horrible rash. And so the rash that many people get after coming into contact is because the urushiol, which is always present in high levels. So what type of defense is it? If it's always present in high levels, it's constitutive. Okay, it's not induced. Induced means it has to be induced later on. Okay, and so poison ivy is a great example. Don't go touch it for fun. Many of you might not have a rash from it right now or might not respond to it. I'm just giving you a friendly warning. I didn't respond to it when I was younger either. I could be, when I was working for Department of Natural Resources, I could be up to my neck in it and it didn't impact me at all. It wasn't until I had spent so much time in poison ivy that my body started to recognize it. My immune system started recognizing it as a threat. And then, of course, once it did, then it started to get rashes. And now I'm pretty allergic to it. And my husband is even more allergic than I am, which always makes for an interesting field season fun. Okay, so let's apply this again. If a defensive compound is always present, then it must be constitutive defense. Take a moment. Pause lecture, think through it. The answer is false. Okay, so some induced defenses are present in a critter at low concentrations, but then once that plant gets attacked, it will respond and it will increase its levels of defense. Okay. Now, please realize that some ecologists will consider that an inducible defense. Others say it was always there, so it's constitutive. I don't care. Choose one, okay? So this is just something to know that researchers argue over. You know, plants also, you guys should know, are amazing because they do all these crazy things. And to be able to induce a chemical defense because you know that you're getting munched on by an herbivore, again, we don't give our plant brethren enough credit because they actually can tell. When it comes to chemical defenses, great examples are milkweeds and monarchs, okay? So milkweed produce toxins and a quick-setting glue, and a few insects like monarch butterflies have evolved to be able to feed on milkweed despite those defenses. And so the really cool part about this is they're basically stealing the plant defenses, they sequester them and use them to defend themselves, okay? So it's the cardinaloids, by the way, that are the toxic compounds, and those will ultimately affect the heart rhythm of most vertebrates, which is why they tend to avoid consuming the butterflies. This is also how other butterfly species might start to look like them because of the fact that birds learn to leave them alone, in which case then anything that kind of resembles a monarch by mimicry, it's termed mimicry, by the way, the birds might leave those alone too, which is pretty cool from an evolutionary perspective. So the monarch gets steroids from the milkweed plants, and that will make them toxic to many vertebrate predators. And naive blue jays will feed on monarchs containing the cardinaloids, and then they'll throw up after eating the monarchs. If you can imagine a blue jay throwing up, okay? Well, don't, but anyway. So I actually had a picture of it previously, and I forgot to put it into this lecture. So the higher the concentration of the toxin, the effect is higher. And blue jays are smart, and so most birds will learn to avoid those particular butterflies because they know that it's just going to make them sick. There's also this really cool evolutionary event that our bodies go through that once something makes you sick, you just don't want to eat it again. And that's where that comes from because there's no point in eating something that made you sick before, which, you know, again, evolution's cool. Okay, it's time for us to mosey on over to predation. We'll talk about defenses and then regulation of predator populations and all sorts of other good stuff. So predators are actually a pretty important factor in the ecology and evolution of prey. Okay, so you've got those, remember we talked about those per capita vital rates, those birth rates, and the immigration rates, and then the death rates and emigration rates. Well, predators in theory are going to impact all of these, okay? So they have a pretty big impact on the environment. And so I know that there's those nature shows that show the predators and so forth. And so I can never stand to watch those. But at least gives you an idea that if you happen to see them, that nature is not always the kindest and most gentlest thing. So, because prey can affect the behavior so much, they will impact the vital rate. So, how could predation affect emigration? Well, prey might choose to leave an area to avoid the predators, okay? How could predation affect the immigration? Well, a lot of times the prey might not come into an area where the predators are present, and so they might immigrate lower than an area without the predators, okay? So the birth rate might drop if there's, lower feeding rates. The death rate might increase. So you can kind of see that predators are going to have a pretty large impact on their environment in, all of the vital rates. So that's important. Okay, so if you have not seen this example before, you should know this example. Okay, and so have I mentioned you should know this example? Because if you guys choose to take an ecology class, you should know this example like the back of your hand. Do you guys get the hint yet? Because ecology basically starts here when it comes to predation. Okay, so this is a classic experiment. It was done in 1995. They monitored a population for decades, which is the first part that makes it cool. Okay, and they looked at the number of hares per square kilometer and the number of lynx per 100 square kilometer, and they find this amazingly cool pattern where the hare and the lynx populations will cycle every 10 to 11 years on average. And so, the hare population increases, lynx population increases too, then they eat themselves out of house and home, and so then they both crash, and then one increases and the next increases and so forth. And you should definitely be able to see how this goes, and it should kind of make sense, because if you consider the lynx are eating up all the hares and there's nobody left, so the hare population crashes, then the lynx population crashes, but then there's not enough predators around, so the hare population increases again, and then you're getting more hares, so then you get more lynx, so that population increases again. Make sure you guys understand this, okay? As I said, not just for this class, but if you have any intention whatsoever in taking ecology, you're going to see this again. So scientists would then go ahead and do an additional experiment because they wanted to know, so is it really just the predators that are impacting the size of the hare population, or could it possibly be more complex than that? So their hypothesis was it predators or food availability or a combination of the two that would actually drive the hare population cycles, okay? And so here we have a nice little picture of a snowshoe hare, okay? They look very sleek and streamlined. I have a rescue bunny who is not sleek and streamlined. She's outside eating herself out of house and home every chance she gets on the violets as we speak. So, but she's, of course, been domesticated, so that's why she's not so streamlined. Okay, so again, their hypothesis is it predators or food availability or a combination of factors that drive the hare population cycles? So what they did is they had controls, 3 of them, okay? And keep in mind that all plots are 1 square kilometer, so that's pretty big. They then had a site where they had a predator exclusion fence, so an electric fence. If you guys have ever been zapped by an electric fence, you will know why the predators stay out. You then have an area that has been spiked with extra food, but the predators can still get there. And then last but not least, you have an area where you have the exclusion fence and extra food, okay? And so they collected data on hare abundance for over 10 years. You've got to give them credit for this because of the fact that was really, I'm sure that was a real challenge, and over 10 years, I'm sure the funding was probably for the only first 3. The question you might have is, why didn't the researchers do more replicates per treatment? Well, this is a pretty big area, okay? So a kilometer. In order to be able to do this, they had to be able to actually conduct the experiment, okay? So ideally, they would have had like 100 replicates or something, but ultimately you're going to be limited by something. So they did the best they could, and they actually found some pretty interesting results. So let's think about this. Once again, multiple choice question, guys. Okay, so if the only factor controlling hair abundance is predation, where would you see the highest hair densities? Okay, so stop lecture, think about it, choose your answer. The answer, by the way, is D. And it's the reason it's D is because both of them with the electric fence, they are going to have the highest hair densities. The food isn't really going to make a difference. Okay, so it's going to be A and C because you're focusing on just the electric fence. If that does not make sense, by the way, please let me know. Okay, so these are results, by the way, that they actually found. So the average hair density, they have their controls, they have their predators excluded areas, they had their food added area, and then voila, lo and behold, they have the predators excluded and food added. Okay, so given this information, stop lecture, choose the what the results indicate. And the answer should be C. They did the best when they added food and then the predators were limited. Okay, so make sure that that makes sense to you. So what you have to keep in mind is that prey are under strong selection to avoid predators, okay? Avoid being eaten, and that should make sense. And predators, of course, are under strong selection to catch their prey because that's how they make their living, all right? So that's where you sort of get these, extra defenses and so forth that kick in because one is always trying to outdo the other one. So animals, believe it or not, can also have constitutive and induced defenses. Okay, and so some researchers wanted to ask, why is it that certain mussel populations, their strength of their shell, their thickness of their shell seems to increase in the presence of predators? And in addition to that, the number of attachment fibers they have seems to increase in the presence of predators. So what they wanted to do was to conduct an experiment and figure out why is there such a difference in the presence of high number of predators versus low number of predators with regards to these two factors. Because if you're a mussel, okay, it takes energy to make a thicker shell and it takes energy to have more attachment fibers. And if you have a predator crab around, that might have something to do with it. So to address this question, what happened was scientists conducted a pretty clever experiment. And so what they did was they had some seawater filter into some tanks that were connected. Okay, so in the first tank there were no crabs, and then that was the control, and then the water would flow through that and it would flow to the mussels. In the second tank they had the presence of a crab, but they kept the crabs separate from the mussels. Okay, but what they wanted to know was, what would eventually happen to the mussels if they could somehow detect, the presence of those crabs. Would there something change that would suggest that they, would have a induced defense? And so you got to admit, given, it's a really clever experiment. The null hypothesis prediction is that mussels will have, shells of equal thickness. The prediction, if the hypothesis is true, is downstream of the crab, they'll have thicker shells than downstream of the empty tank. And lo and behold, the results of the experiment are on the right, and they found that shell thickness did increase in the presence of the crab. Okay, so when they can detect the crabs, they will actually invest in their shell thickness. Now, if you happen to be curious, I guess the attachment fibers, it was a little more complex than that. So the results are not actually shown here, okay? However, they did find, evidence for that in one of the two induced defenses, which is pretty cool. Okay, so let's talk the parasites, and we'll first gross you guys out and talk about the biomass of parasites. Then we'll talk about how parasites can impact host behavior. And I will tell you, if you guys are fascinated by parasites or if you have an interest, there used to be this really cool TV show called Monsters Inside Me. If you guys get curious, go to YouTube and type in Monsters Inside Me. Make sure that you're not eating anything and that you don't have a queasy stomach because it can be pretty gross. But if you're fascinated by this stuff, which I'll even admit I think is kind of cool, those episodes were actually pretty fascinating. And yes, humans at one point in time had a lot of parasites in us. We are cleaner now than we've ever been, okay? But parasitism is definitely a successful way for those critters to eke out a living, and they do quite well. So here we have some examples of all sorts of different parasites. So we have a upper left is the dodder, which is a parasitic plant. And yes, plants can be parasitic too. At the upper right, we have the Ebola virus, technically also a parasite. Lower right, intestinal roundworms, definitely a parasite. And lower left, the cordyceps fungus. I'm going to show you a really awesome video on cordyceps, by the way. And so this will change your perspective on fungi, if nothing else, which is pretty awesome. These guys are so cool. Okay, guys, is the cordyceps awesome or what? Okay, it's so cool. All right, what that fungus can actually do. So what you might not realize is that approximately 50% of species are parasites. Okay, kind of a big number. And also, host parasite evolution is very common, okay? And something that I found interesting, I really don't understand why this is even being debated, is on the next slide right here. Some days I swear scientists argue just for the sake of arguing, okay? And so there's actually a question on whether or not, ticks are actually considered parasites. So before we go any further, I'm going to share with you all my tick story. And I used to work many, many years ago for the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and I was a waterfowl biologist assistant person. And one of the studies we had ongoing was to monitor the success of mallard ducks and their broods, and so how many offspring they had. So the way we would actually estimate this is we would sew a little radio transmitter on their back, and then every single day we would go and find the mothers, and then we would count how many babies they had, okay, because this let us figure out how successful these guys actually were. Now, the reason this involved ticks is because you were going through, I was going through wetlands and all sorts of other interesting areas and so forth. And so there were definitely, propensity to run into some ticks. Well, there was one day in particular, it was the end of the day, and I was tired and crabby, and I was trying to get the visual on my last female and was paying no attention to where I was walking whatsoever. And so I finally find my last female and walking through super tall grass. And so I get a visual, count the babies, record my data, and I get the heck out of there as fast as I could. Well, before I could do that, though, I needed to use a restroom. So at this area, there was some construction going on, so I went in to use the porta potty. Now, I didn't want to drop my keys down into the porta potty. So there was a lot of construction, as I said. So I, went in to the porta potty, and I stuck my keys in my t-shirt, and I rolled my t-shirt up a little bit to make sure I didn't drop them down into the hole, because that would have been hideous. And the next thing you know, I see a tick, okay, that is underneath my shirt. So then I pull off the tick and I stick it down the porta potty, and then I'm going to go about doing my business, and then I roll my shirt up a little bit further, and then lo and behold, there's another tick. At this point in time, I'm starting to worry. Okay, and so then what happens is that I pull off the second tick and I throw it in the porta potty, and then I'm thinking, uh-oh. So then I take my keys out of my shirt, I pull my shirt off inside out, and I notice that I am covered in ticks, okay, all over my shirt. None of them had attached yet, but I was covered. So I then will admit that I started freaking out a little bit. And so I started shaking my shirt up and down, up and down, up and down, which did absolutely nothing, by the way. The ticks didn't let go. They held on. But what did start to happen is the porta potty started to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Because, again, I was freaking out a little bit. Well, there was some construction guys outside, and I will never forget one of them was saying, "What the?" Because they didn't understand why the porta potty was shaking back and forth, okay? Well, at this point in time, I'm hyperventilating, but realizing that nothing that I'm doing is actually helping my situation. So then I start to just compose myself or do the best I can, and I start pulling ticks off of my shirt and throwing them into the porta potty. All right. So I counted somewhere between 50 and 60. I think it was like 58 ticks or something like that. And essentially what happened is I walked through a tick nest and wasn't paying any attention, and they all attached to my shirt. Okay. Lesson, watch where you walk. Although honestly, I'm not sure I would have seen it anyway. So, I go back to the field station, and I, am talking to one of my office mates and so forth and telling her the story, and she starts laughing, and she's like, well, you know the worst part of this, don't you? And I'm like, no, what? And she's like, ticks won't drown. She's like, imagine whoever the next poor person was that had to go in and use that porta potty. Oh dear. If there's an afterlife, I'm going to hear about it in that one. Anyway, so my actual vote, are ticks parasites? Heck yes. I'm not really sure why that there is a difference or even a question about this. However, there was a study that was done not all that long ago where they looked at seabirds and how often they would desert the nests, including eggs and young. Okay, so they looked at cormorants and boobies and pelicans and so forth, and then they looked to see the tick prevalence. Okay, so when it comes to the number of ticks, okay, that when you have these infested nests, and you look at the, over time, does that make a difference in whether or not the birds will desert their nest? The answer is yes, they do. And so that, shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that birds, unfortunately, will desert their nests if the ticks get out of control. Okay, so again, I really don't understand why they were even questioning this to begin with, because anything that is going to try and suck my blood, of course, that's a parasite, but okay, fine, whatever. The data just kind of support what we already knew. So ecologists went one step further to conduct a 10-year field study of the interaction between ticks and brown pelicans. They found that the fitness of brown pelicans decreased when tick density is high, but the fitness of the birds is not affected under low tick densities. Based on these field results, ecologists would categorize the interaction between these two species of low tick densities as one thing and as something else under high tick densities. I'm trying to train you guys in the best way possible, okay, based on what ecologists in the field will show. I'm telling you I don't agree with this answer. They're parasites. Anything that's going to suck my blood or something along those lines is going to, somehow they could carry disease or something along those lines. I think they're just arguing semantics here. I would accept my answer, which would be A, and I would argue that with anybody. The answer that they're looking for at low tick densities is commensalism, which is C, and then parasitism. I will accept either one. Realize, though, that if you guys go on to ecology, they're going to want you to choose C. Okay, so I'm going to leave that up to you. Now, this question to me is actually quite interesting, and what we may not realize is parasites can actually account for a large part of the biomass in food webs. And so another research study was done that quantified the biomass of animals as well as parasites in 3 different California estuaries, okay? And so basically what they did was they caught the birds, they then sacrificed the birds, dissected them, looked for parasites to see how many they could count in the birds, and then they weighed them by biomass, okay? Which, again, we think of parasites as being, ooh, gross, but they seem to be eking out a pretty good living and doing quite well. This was an enormous study. Basically, they counted, dissected, and weighed over 17,000 animals. I can tell you I worked in the field of a wetlands. There were days I was muddier than this, okay, and grosser than this. And so if you guys are into field science and you like doing stuff like this, go for it. You're out in the field every day, and it's super exciting and wonderful. I personally... this was not my favorite thing to do. I loved my time as a waterfowl biologist, but the reality is I'm much better suited for a lab because that's much more natural to me. Okay, so the biomass density is on the y-axis, and then the different parasite groups that are classified is on the x-axis. And these results might surprise you, okay? So there's actually a parasite group, a trematode parasite group, where the parasite biomass exceeds the biomass of the birds, okay? So there's more parasite biomass than there is bird biomass. On some levels, that's incredibly interesting. In fact, the scientist in me thinks that's fascinating. But the person in me, my first response is, ew. Sorry, that's just me. You guys might, not respond quite that way, but boy, I do. Whether we realize that parasites can also alter host behavior. And so sometimes it's because the behavior promotes transmission of the parasite. So one example of this, and there are labs on Michigan's campus, by the way, that do research on this, on Toxoplasmosa gondii. So there's 2 parts of the life cycle for this parasite. There's a sexual and an asexual component. The sexual phase must take place in cats, okay? So the asexual phase can take place anywhere. Well, what's interesting about this is mice who have actually are impacted by this parasite, their behavior changes. changes. Usually mice will avoid the smell of cat urine or cat pee, and so if they sense that there's presence of a cat, they will actually take off. Well, if they're infected with toxo, it actually turns out that they are attracted to the smell of cat urine. Okay, so they are going against their instincts then, and they're, being attracted towards where cats might potentially be, and that's altered by the parasite. Now, I'm not a big believer in Hollywood horror movies or anything along those lines where you have something that changes your behavior, but this to me is fascinating. And parasites, they're pretty interesting. Humans, by the way, can also be infected with toxo. And so apparently those who are, the smell of cat pee does not bother them as much as those who are not. Now, again, it's interesting. It doesn't, harm us at all, and the parasite doesn't seem to make any difference in us whatsoever with regard to our fitness. Humans now, by the way, we are cleaner than we ever have been with regards to parasites and so forth. In fact, there's a hypothesis out there that we're actually too clean, and this is why we get things like allergies and all that. If you guys are interested, check it out. It's called the hygiene hypothesis. Stop lecture. Go Google the hygiene hypothesis, read a reliable source, meaning it's .gov or .edu or something along those lines, and and you'll see that we're cleaner now than ever, and that might be why our immune systems kind of go into overdrive over certain things that they shouldn't. Okay, so anyway, the toxo does alter the behavior of the mice. And so if you guys ever watch too many Hollywood movies as far as zombies and all that, however, certain parasites, though, do seem to have the capacity to change behavior, which is pretty cool. Oh, I forgot to talk about the study, by the way, where they found that this actually alters the behavior of mice. And so they had an experimental area where they divvied up into 4 different areas. And so they had a treatment of infected and uninfected rats. They treated these different areas with urine. So they had rabbit urine, a control, cat urine, and let the mice kind of pick out where they were going to be. So what they did was they measured the proportion of time in the quadrat with the bobcat urine versus the quadrat with the rabbit urine. So here's the question. Why was there a rabbit urine treatment? Well, they had to make sure that the parasite that was affecting the mice, so they'd go after the bobcat, because rabbits, of course, are not, not actually predators. They're, fluffy little herbivores, and they wanted to know whether or not the parasite would make them go towards urine at all, or specifically bobcat urine. So make sure that makes sense. Okay, so based on what we talked about, what do you think they found? Stop lecture, read through the questions, choose your answer. Hopefully you chose answer E. Okay, so infected animals were attracted to bobcat urine and uninfected animals avoided the bobcat urine. Make sure that makes sense, okay? But seriously, it's a parasite, guys. How cool is that? So, again, the human side of me, ooh, but the scientist in me, this is really cool. Okay, so if you have any questions, definitely let me know. So what I want you guys to do is to stop lecture and fill in this table, okay? And actually what I'd really like you to do is to recopy this table onto your notes, because you're much more likely to remember it and then fill everything in, okay? So an excellent question on the next upcoming exam, which, by the way, will be a week from Monday, unless, of course, it interferes with your schedule, in which case talk to me first, okay? Obviously, I need to relearn how to read a calendar. Sorry, guys. It was not intentional. Just having one of those days. Anyway, your GSIS and I chatted, and we realized it was scheduled for the 15th, which is actually a decent day. But again, if it interferes and you guys are having issues, let me know. We'll figure something out. All right? So, but do go ahead and fill in the following table. Also, I'm going to attach a couple of articles to this lecture, as well as some videos, which are pretty awesome, and it's all fair game, so make sure you take the time to go through it, and it's just meant to give you some extra depth on this information, which is pretty cool. Okay, all right, so you guys stay safe and have a good day, and I will talk to you on Wednesday.